At 67, Helen walked into a courtroom and gave away a $3 million house. Not because she had to, because she chose to.
I never thought I'd be back
Her lawyer
here.
grabbed her arm. Her
After
husband's
all this
attorney
time.
stopped mid-sentence. The judge looked up from his papers for the first time all morning. No one in that room understood what she was doing. But here is what they didn't know that morning before the courthouse. Helen had stood in her kitchen for 20 minutes holding a hotel receipt, 14 nights. Richard's name. It was the third one she had found in 2 years. The first two she had put in a drawer and said nothing. She was done saying nothing. She signed the papers with hands that did not shake, walked out into the afternoon sun, and in her purse was a single key, old brass, worn smooth to a place no one knew she still had. What she found behind that door changed everything, and it started with a woman she had never met, standing on a doorstep with a loaf of bread and no questions at all. The coffee was already cold when Helen finally moved. She didn't know how long she had been standing there. Long enough for the light to shift from gray to pale yellow along the kitchen floor. Long enough for the clock above the stove to tick its way through 20 minutes of silence that wasn't peaceful, it was just empty. That was the thing about this house. It had always been quiet in the wrong way. She was 67 years old. The kitchen was imported marble and custom cabinetry and a refrigerator that cost more than her first car. The windows looked out over a yard so carefully landscaped it didn't look like anything lived there. Nothing did really. Not anymore. Her bare feet found the cold in the floor the way they always did. She had learned after 31 years exactly which tiles ran coldest at 6 in the morning. She had learned a great many things about this house. She had learned to move through it quietly, to occupy it without disturbing it, to live in it the way you live in a museum, carefully and without touching anything that mattered. She set the coffee down. That was when she saw it. A piece of paper on the counter folded once. She recognized the logo before she even reached for it. A hotel downtown. The kind with a restaurant on the ground floor and a bar on the 42nd, and rooms that cost more per night than most people spent on groceries in a week. She unfolded it. Richard's name. 14 nights. Last month. She stood very still. The clock kept ticking. Somewhere outside, a car started and pulled away. The refrigerator hummed its low, indifferent hum. She read the dates again. Then she set the paper down. Slowly. Carefully. The way she had done this before. Because this was not the first time she had stood in this kitchen holding a piece of paper that told her something she did not want to know. The first receipt she had found 14 months ago tucked inside a jacket pocket she was sending to the dry cleaner. She had stared at it for a long time. Then she had folded it and put it in the back of the drawer beside the stove, underneath the takeout menus and the expired coupons and the other things that lived there, because no one could decide whether to keep them or throw them away. 6 months after that, the second one. A credit card statement this time. 3 dinners at a restaurant she had never been to. She recognized the address she had driven past. It once seen the kind of lighting that meant the kind of place you went when you wanted not to be seen. She had put that one in the same drawer. She had told herself she needed more time, more certainty, more of something she couldn't name. She had told herself a great many things. This was the third time. She already knew how to fold the paper so it fit exactly in the back of the drawer. She picked it up again. The marble was cold under her feet. The clock kept its count. The coffee sat where she had left it, past the point of drinking, past the point of warmth. She stood there for a long moment with the paper in her hand. And then she did something she had not done the first 2 times. She left it on the counter. She left it right there in the open in the pale morning light, where it could be seen. and she went to get dressed. She had an appointment at 9 o'clock. A courtroom downtown. A judge who had read through 31 years of a marriage and reduced it to a stack of documents 2 inches thick. She hadn't decided yet what she was going to do. Or maybe she had. Maybe she had decided 14 months ago the first time she opened that drawer. Maybe she had just needed 3 receipts to be sure. The courtroom smelled like old wood and something that might have been despair. Helen had expected it to feel larger. It didn't. It was a modest room with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them with difficult things on their minds. The kind of room that had heard every version of every story and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. She sat with her hands in her lap. Still. Not performing stillness, just still, the way you get when you have been bracing for something long enough that the bracing becomes its own kind of rest. Across the room, Richard sat with his attorney. The attorney was young, sharp suit. He kept checking his phone under the table, which told Helen everything she needed to know about how he expected the morning to go. Richard had not looked at her once. Not when they entered. Not when the proceedings began. Not through 40 minutes of lawyers exchanging the language of dissolution assets and entitlements and the division of a life into columns on a spreadsheet. 31 years. And he could not look at her across a room. Her own lawyer, Patricia, was doing her job well. Helen could hear that much. She heard the words, primary homemaker and career sacrifice and equitable distribution, and she understood that Patricia was building something careful and sound on her behalf. She watched Richard's hands instead. She had known those hands for 31 years, the way the left one drummed when he was thinking. The particular stillness of them when he had already decided something and was only waiting for everyone else to catch up. She was looking at them now and finding them unfamiliar, the way a word looks wrong if you stare at it too long. She thought, I don't know this person. Not with anger, not with grief exactly. More the way you might feel standing in a room you lived in for decades after everything has been moved out, recognizing the shape of something that no longer holds what it used to. Patricia was mid-sentence when Helen said, I'd like to speak. The room shifted. The judge looked up. Patricia turned. Richard's attorney stopped typing. Richard still did not look at her. Helen addressed the judge in a normal voice. Not steady because she was brave. Steady because she was done. Your Honor, I'd like to accept a settlement of $120,000 and release my claim to the marital property. Silence. Patricia's hand found her arm immediately. Helen shook her head. Once. Small. The judge leaned forward. He asked if she understood what she was giving up. He named the number the house was worth. He used the word irrevocable. I understand, Helen said. I'm 67 years old. I don't have time left to spend it fighting over the wrong things. She signed where they indicated. The pen moved across the paper. That was the only sound. Her own lawyer looked at her the way people look at someone standing at the edge of something very high, not certain whether to reach out or step back. From across the room, Richard spoke for the first time all morning. You'll regret this. His voice was even, practiced. When you realize what you've done, when you have nowhere to go and no one, she heard the words. She was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a house she had not been inside in 11 years. A small house, 1 story, a street called Elm, a key she had carried so long, the brass had worn smooth in her palm, and she had never once explained to anyone why she still had it. She stood up. She did not look at Richard. She walked out of the courtroom into the afternoon, and the light outside was the ordinary light of an ordinary Thursday, and the city moved around her the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. She did not look back. In her purse was a key she had been carrying for 11 years without ever explaining why. The key turned slowly, like something waking up after a long sleep. She had to jiggle it twice before the lock gave. The door swung inward with a sound, not a creak exactly, more a long exhale the way old houses breathe when someone finally comes back to them. Helen stood in the doorway and did not go in right away. 50 minutes from the courthouse. She had driven without music, without the radio, just the sound of the city thinning out, fewer lanes, lower buildings, front yards instead of parking structures. At some point, the highway became an avenue, and the avenue became a street, and the street became the kind of neighborhood where people left their garden hoses out and didn't think much about it. Number 12, Elm Street. One story, maybe 1,100 square feet. The white paint had gone the color of old paper. One side of the porch dipped slightly like a shoulder carrying something heavy for a long time. The mailbox leaned. A maple tree she didn't remember planting had grown up through the corner of the front yard and now threw shade across the whole left side of the house. She had kept the key for 11 years. Richard had assumed they would sell. She had never quite gotten around to it. She went inside. The smell hit her first. Dust and closed air and something underneath both of those old wood, the particular dry warmth of a house that has been shut up through several summers. She stood in the small entryway and let her eyes adjust. The floors were hardwood under a layer of grime. The walls still had their original color, a soft yellow. She had chosen herself from a strip of paint samples in a hardware store, back when choosing paint colors felt like the most important decision in the world. The kitchen was to the left, the bathroom straight ahead, 2 bedrooms down the short hall. She went slowly. The kitchen still had the same linoleum. She had always meant to replace it. The bathroom faucet dripped once when she touched the handle, then went quiet. The first bedroom, hers and Richard's, she stood in the doorway and looked at without going in. Then she went to Nathan's room. It was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was just used to bigger things now. A single window looked out onto the side yard. The closet door still had the same glass knob, and on the door frame, the one between the room and the hallway, the marks were still there. Pencil. Dates written in her own hand. Small notations beside each line. 6 months. 1 year. 18 months. She had done them every 6 months when he was little, then every year after that. 2 years. 3 years. 4 years October. She put her finger on the lowest mark. The wood was smooth there, slightly paler where the pencil line had faded, but never disappeared. She could feel the indentation where she had pressed down hard enough to make it last. 5 years. 6 years. The last one was up near her shoulder. August 12th, first day of school. She remembered that morning. Nathan in new sneakers backpack, too big for his frame, standing against this door frame while she found the pencil. He had been nervous. She had pretended not to notice, made a small ceremony of it. Instead, stand up straight, chin up, there you go. Richard had not been there. He'd had a meeting. Something that couldn't be moved. She had understood, or told herself she did. She had taken Nathan to school alone and come home to this empty house and stood in this doorway for a while before getting on with her day. He had missed it. She had not thought about that in 30 years. She stood there a moment longer. Then she sat down on the floor, back against the wall, courthouse clothes and all. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the dusty floor in a long stripe. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. The house was quiet in the way this house had always been quiet, not empty, just still, waiting. She had not cried at the courthouse. She cried now, sitting on the floor of her son's old bedroom, because she had just remembered what it felt like to be in a place where she had been completely herself. Her back ached from the floor, and the house was still empty, and she was 67 years old, and none of that felt like a reason to get up until someone knocked. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Water stain in the corner she didn't remember. Morning light coming in flat and pale through a window that hadn't been cleaned in years. Her neck had a crick in it from the sleeping bag bunching up sometime in the night. She got up slowly, the way you do when your body has opinions about the floor. The knock came again. Not urgent, just patient. She opened the door to a woman about her age, maybe a few years younger, standing on the sagging porch with a loaf of bread wrapped in a blue dish towel. The bread was still warm. Helen could feel the heat of it from where she stood. The woman said, "I saw your light on last night. I'm Carol. I live at 14. She held out the bread. That was all. No, are you all right? And no, what happened? And no careful tilting of the head. That meant I have noticed you are in some kind of trouble, and I would like you to know that I have noticed. Just the bread, and her name, and the number of her house." Helen took it. They ended up sitting on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit. Helen made coffee on the camping stove she'd brought in her overnight bag, the one practical thing she'd thought to pack. And Carol sat with her legs crossed and held her mug with both hands and looked around the room the way people look at a place that used to be something and is becoming something again. She mentioned a few names. The man at number 9 who kept excellent tomatoes and would sometimes leave a bag on your step without saying anything. The woman across the street, Diane, who ran the community garden at the end of the block, and who Carol described as not unfriendly, just careful. A hardware store 2 streets over that was locally owned and gave senior discounts on Tuesdays. She did not ask what had brought Helen here. She did not ask about the rest of it. Carol broke the bread with her hands, tore it cleanly along the grain, the way someone does when they've done it 1,000 times. When bread is just bread, and sharing it is just what you do, and set half on the floor between them on the dish towel. They ate. The coffee was too strong because Helen had guessed at the ratio. Neither of them mentioned it. 20 minutes, maybe a little more. Then Carol set down her mug and got to her feet with the ease of someone who had made peace with her knees. At the door she paused. "I moved here 7 years ago," she said. "Alone. First loaf of bread I got came from the woman who used to live next door. Margaret. She passed 2 years ago." A small pause. "I still make an extra loaf sometimes." She left before Helen could think of what to say. The door closed. The house was quiet. She had spent 30 years explaining herself to people who never really listened. Carol had not asked a single question. That was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. She sat back down on the floor and finished her coffee, which had gone lukewarm, and ate the rest of the bread slowly, and the morning light moved across the dusty floor the way it does when no one is rushing it anywhere. She ate the bread alone on the floor, and it was warm, and outside someone's lawnmower was starting up, and it occurred to her that she had not heard that sound, ordinary Tuesday morning neighborhood sound, in a very long time. The garden smelled like wet soil and something growing, which was more than Helen could say for most things in her life right now. Carol had walked her down at 7:30 before the heat came in. The lot sat at the end of Elm Street, where the road curved and dead-ended, a space that might have been a parking area once or nothing in particular, and had been turned by the people on this street into something that fed them. Raised beds in neat rows. A small greenhouse along the back fence, its plastic panels fogged with condensation. 12 people working quietly in the early morning. The way people work when they know what they're doing and don't need to talk about it. Carol introduced her around. Names came and went. Helen nodded and tried to hold on to them. Then Carol said, "And this is Diane." The woman was 71, maybe 72, small with the kind of posture that comes from decades of not slouching. She looked at Helen the way you look at a load-bearing wall you're not sure about, not hostile, just measuring. She did not say hello. She said, "Are you planning to stay, or are you just passing through?" Helen looked at her. "I don't know yet, but I'm here today." Diane held her gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to her plants. Helen was assigned the row of beans running parallel to Diane's. Someone handed her gloves. She pulled them on and got to work. They went 2 hours without exchanging a word. Helen learned things about Diane without being told them. The way her hands moved down a row, not fast, but never stopping, checking each plant with the same brief attention. A touch here, a pinch there, nothing wasted. She knew this garden the way you know something you've tended through more than one season. She didn't consult anyone. She didn't hesitate. Helen was pulling weeds from the base of a bean plant when she felt resistance, looked down, and realized she had gotten hold of a seedling instead. Young, maybe 3 inches. She had pulled it halfway out before she noticed. She froze. Diane's hand appeared beside hers. No words. Just one finger pointing down at the soil, at the small hole where the seedling had come from. Helen pressed it back in, firmed the soil around it with her thumb. Diane's hand withdrew. They kept working. At the end of the morning, as people were pulling off their gloves and stacking tools, a man Helen didn't know yet, older, moving slowly, a veteran's cap, came to stand beside her while she was washing her hands at the outdoor tap. He said it quietly, not looking at her. The way you say something you're not sure needs saying, but feels like it should be said anyway. Diane's husband passed last year. Harold. He planted that row of beans. He walked away before she could respond. Helen turned and looked back across the garden to where Diane was still working, bent low over the row, her hands moving through the leaves with that same unhurried certainty. She had put her hands into someone else's grief without knowing it. And somehow that felt exactly right. She looked down at her own hands, the seedling she had nearly pulled the soil still under her thumbnail where she had pressed it back. She looked at Diane's back, bent over the row of beans that had apparently belonged to someone else first, and she thought some losses don't announce themselves. They just show up every morning and get to work. She had been thinking about planting tomatoes when the phone rang. Not seriously. Just the idle kind of thinking you do when you're eating alone and the evening is quiet and your mind needs somewhere small to go. Carol had mentioned a man on the street who grew good ones. Helen had been turning that over, whether the side yard got enough sun, whether she still remembered how her mother had done it, whether that counted as a plan or just a wish. The phone screen lit up on the table beside her bowl. Nathan. She set down her spoon. He was 40 years old and lived in Chicago and called on Sundays, usually in the mid-afternoon. This was a Thursday evening. She knew before she answered that Thursday evening calls were a different thing. "Mom." His voice was careful, the kind of careful that means someone has been thinking about how to start. "Hi, sweetheart." A pause, then I talked to Dad. She waited. "He said you walked out of the settlement, that you refused what the lawyers had agreed on and just left. He said you gave up the house." Another pause. "Is that true? It's more complicated than, did you give up the house?" "Yes." She heard him exhale. "Mom, why would you do that?" She tried to explain it the way it had actually happened, the receipts, 3 of them, over 2 years, the drawer beside the stove where she had put them one by one and said nothing. She kept her voice even. She told it in order. When she finished, Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have any evidence of this? Or is this just how you're seeing it? The kitchen was very still. Evidence. She heard the word and thought about the drawer in the mansion kitchen, the takeout menus and the expired coupons, and the 3 folded pieces of paper she had left behind when she packed her one suitcase. Left behind deliberately, or maybe just forgotten, or maybe she had not been able to decide which. She had the evidence. She had chosen the drawer instead. "I know what I found," she said. "Dad says there's another explanation. That you were already looking for a way out, and you—" "Nathan, I'm not saying he's right, I know what I found." He didn't push further, but he didn't say he believed her either. The call wound down the way calls do, when both people have run out of the words that would actually help. A few careful sentences, a promise to talk soon, a goodbye that landed with the particular flatness of something unresolved. She set the phone on the table. Her own son. 40 years old. And he sounded exactly like his father. Not the words, the tone, the careful reasonableness of a man who had already decided something and was now collecting information to support it rather than question it. She had heard that tone across dinner tables and in quiet hallways for 31 years, and she recognized it the way you recognize a weather pattern, not with surprise, just with the particular sinking feeling of knowing what was coming next. She picked up her bowl and took it to the sink. The water ran cold at first, then warm. She added soap. She washed the bowl once, rinsed it, and then stood there with it in her hands. She washed it again. The window above the sink was dark now, just her own reflection. Looking back, yellow light behind her, the small kitchen behind that, the house around all of it. She looked older than she felt. Or maybe she felt exactly as old as she looked, and had just not been paying attention. She washed the bowl a 3rd time. She washed the bowl 3 times. It had been clean after the first. The shoebox was on the highest shelf, which was where she had always put things she wasn't ready to look at. She had been clearing the wall closet for an hour, working through the things left behind. When she and Richard had moved to the mansion 30 years ago, the things neither of them had thought worth taking, but neither of them had gotten around to throwing away. Old tax documents, a broken clock radio, a pair of curtains still in their packaging, the wrong size for any window in this house, bought for a room that no longer existed. She pulled the shoebox down and sat on the floor with it in her lap. Inside, a diary with a blue cover, the kind you find in a drugstore, nothing special. A pen clipped into the spine, the ink long dried. And underneath the diary, folded small, a piece of notepaper with her own handwriting on it, a grocery list from what looked like 2019. Milk. Bread. Call the dentist. The ordinary record of an ordinary day that had no idea what was coming. She set the grocery list aside. She opened the diary. The first entry was dated 2 years before she left. She recognized her own handwriting and felt the strange displacement of reading words you wrote in a different version of your life, like finding a letter from someone you used to know, except the someone was you. She had written about the first receipt, the hotel downtown, Richard's name. She had written about standing in the kitchen holding it, and about the drawer, and about her reasons for putting it there. She had not written "I was afraid." She had written around it the way you write around the thing you cannot say directly, circling it with other words, until the shape of it became clear anyway. But one sentence she had written plainly. "If I don't look at it, perhaps it isn't real." She sat with that for a moment. She turned pages. The entries came regularly at first, every few days, sometimes every day. She wrote about the house and about Richard and about Nathan, who had just started a new job in Chicago and called on Sundays. She wrote about small things, a dinner party, a garden she had seen in a magazine and thought about planting and never did. The entries had the quality of a person talking to themselves because there was no one else to talk to. Then 6 months in the second receipt. She had written about that too. The handwriting was different on that page. Smaller. The pen had pressed harder into the paper, the way handwriting changes when the hand holding it is working to stay steady. She had written 3 paragraphs and then crossed out 2 of them. What remained was one sentence I told myself I would know when it was time. After that, the entries grew shorter, then sporadic. Then there were gaps of weeks, a month, 6 weeks. The writing of someone who had started a conversation with herself and was finding it harder and harder to continue. The last entry was dated the morning of her 65th birthday. She had written a full page. Helen read it slowly. It was the most honest thing in the diary, the kind of writing that comes when you have stopped performing, even for yourself, when it is just you and the page and the thing you have been not saying for 2 years. At the bottom of the page, the last 2 sentences. Today, I promised myself I would be braver, but I don't yet know what brave looks like. Then nothing. She turned the page. Blank. Turned another. Blank. She fanned through the remaining pages with her thumb, all of them empty white, waiting for entries that had never come. Waiting for courage was just another name for fear. She closed the diary, set it on the table in front of her. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was fully dark now, the kind of dark that comes after 9 o'clock in early autumn, when the days are still shortening, and you keep being surprised by how soon the light goes. She looked at it for a while. She had made that promise on her 65th birthday. She had then spent 2 more years in the same house at the same table, getting up every morning and choosing the same silence. Not because she was weak, because the truth had a weight to it that she had not yet figured out how to carry. Because the life she would have to dismantle in order to tell it was also the life that contained her son, her history, the person she had been before she became the person who folded receipts into drawers. She understood now why she had stopped writing. Writing it down meant it was real, and real meant she had to do something about it. And she hadn't been ready. 2 years of empty pages. She had stopped writing the day she decided to stop pretending, and then spent 2 more years pretending anyway. He did not introduce himself. He just picked up the tools and started working, which Helen found to her surprise enormously restful. She had been at the garden since 7:30, same as most Tuesdays now. The morning had the particular quality of late September mornings in this part of the country, cool enough for a jacket, bright enough to make you glad you came outside. She was working the far bed, the one with the tomatoes Carol had mentioned, when she heard the sound of a truck pulling up along the fence line. A man got out. 60-something, maybe nearly 70. Salt and pepper hair cut short. Work boots that had seen actual work. He opened the bed of the truck, took out a toolbox and a length of cedar fencing, and carried them to the section of the garden fence that had been leaning since August. He did not look around to see who was watching. He just started. Carol appeared at Helen's elbow 10 minutes later. "That's my son Frank," she said. "Fence has been on his list since July. He gets to things eventually." She called over to him. Frank looked up, nodded once in Helen's direction. Helen nodded back. That was the introduction. They worked near each other for the better part of 2 hours. Frank on the fence, Helen moving between the beds with the watering can. At some point, she mentioned that the tomatoes on the south end were getting leggy, not enough direct sun. Frank said the fence repair might help, once the leaning section was straightened, open up the light a little. She said that made sense. He went back to work. That was the longest exchange they had. She found herself noticing things without meaning to. The way he measured the fence posts with his eyes before touching them, assessing the lean, the rot, the salvageable from the lost, and only then picking up the tool he needed. No wasted motion. He didn't consult anyone. He didn't explain what he was doing or why. He just worked through the problem in the order it presented itself. She was on her second pass of the tomato beds when she realized she had been listening to the rhythm of his hammer for the past 40 minutes. Not watching. Listening. The pattern of it, 3 solid strikes, a pause, 2 more to set. It had become the background of her morning without her noticing when that had happened. She had not noticed a stranger in years. She had been too busy managing a household full of someone who no longer saw her. Frank finished the section he was working on around 10 o'clock. He loaded his tools back into the truck. He said goodbye to his mother, who was near the greenhouse. He raised a hand in Helen's general direction, without quite looking at her, the gesture of someone who has acknowledged your presence without making it into anything, and got in the truck and left. Carol came to stand beside her. His wife passed 5 years ago, she said. Not loudly. The way you say something when you want it heard but not discussed. Cancer. 2 years of it. A pause. He's not a bad man. He just hasn't figured out how to stay near people anymore. Helen watched the truck turn at the end of the street and disappear. She did not say anything. She picked up the watering can and moved to the next bed. She watched him go and thought not about romance, which felt like a word from another life, but about the particular relief of being near someone who wasn't asking anything of her. Nobody told her that starting over would look mostly like this: hardware stores and second-hand chairs and learning which floorboards would hold and which ones would not. 3 weeks after she moved in, Helen could tell you that the third step on the porch took weight on the left side, but not the right. That the kitchen faucet needed a full turn past where it felt done before it stopped dripping. That the bedroom window stuck in the mornings until the wood had a chance to dry out, and that if you lifted it slightly while pushing, you could get it open without the noise. She had learned these things the way you learn anything that matters, by getting it wrong first. She taught herself to replace the recessed bulbs in the kitchen ceiling by watching a video on her phone 3 times, and then doing it anyway, twice up the ladder, and once back down for the tool she'd forgotten. She repainted the kitchen window frame on a Tuesday, starting with the trim brush she'd bought at the hardware store 2 streets over, where they gave senior discounts, and the man at the counter had told her to go with the satin finish, it held up better. First coat was uneven. She could see the brush marks in the afternoon light. Second coat, she slowed down, let the brush do the work instead of rushing it, and it came out cleaner. Her hands were different now. Not damaged, just changed. There were calluses where there hadn't been before, and she kept finding paint in the creases of her knuckles, no matter how carefully she cleaned up. She was painting the front fence on a Thursday morning when she heard Diane's door open across the street. Diane came out, looked at her, looked at the fence, said nothing, went back inside. Helen kept painting. 2 hours later, she heard footsteps on the path. She turned to find a jar of preserves sitting on the bottom porch step. Diane was already halfway back across the street. No note. No explanation. No backward glance. Helen looked at the jar for a long moment. Plum by the color of it. Homemade by the handwritten label, just the word plum, and a year 2 summers ago. She picked it up and took it inside. That evening, Carol knocked and asked if she could come by for a bit. Helen said yes. Carol brought a bottle of wine. Somewhere in the next hour, Diane appeared at the door with a plate of something covered in foil, which she set on the table, and then sat down beside without anyone having specifically invited her. 2 people from the garden came by: Marcus, who had the veteran's cap, and a younger woman named Yuki, who had brought her daughter, who immediately found the corner of the room most suitable for drawing, and settled there. 7 people in a kitchen built for 2 or maybe 4, if nobody moved around much. They pulled the table out through the back door and set it up in the yard. Carol had brought string lights. "I always have string lights," she said, in a tone that did not invite follow-up questions, and they hung them between the two trees that flanked the back fence, and the yard looked in that particular way that yards sometimes do when you are not expecting it, like exactly the right place to be. The laughter started somewhere around the second glass of wine and didn't really stop. Helen sat at the end of the table and listened to it go around. The particular sound of people who are still learning each other's edges, still finding what's funny and what isn't, still in the early generous stage of new company. And she felt the warmth of the person beside her and smelled the food going around the table. Something Marcus had brought in a pot that he refused to name until everyone had tried it, and the cold air coming in at the edges of the light. She did not think about Richard. She almost noted that, and then decided not to. 3 days later, as Helen was sweeping the back step in the morning, she heard Diane's voice from across the street. "Same time Friday." She said it without looking up from her own front path, where she was doing something with a trowel and a pot of late-season mums. Helen looked over. Diane did not look back. "Yes," Helen said. Diane nodded once the way she nodded when something had been settled and kept working. She had been waiting for belonging to feel like an arrival. It turned out it felt more like a Friday night that nobody had planned. It was Diane who said 3 days later, "Same time Friday," and Helen understood that she had passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. She heard his car before she saw it, the sound of an engine that had never learned the roads around here. She was on the front step with the second coat, working the brush along the grain the way she'd taught herself when the silver sedan turned onto Elm Street and slowed. She recognized it before she could see the driver. That car had sat in the driveway of the mansion for 3 years. She knew the sound of it pulling in at night, the particular way the engine cut off. She kept painting. Richard parked at this curb and got out. Ironed shirt. Good shoes. The clothes of a man who had dressed for something, even if that something was just driving to a street like this one. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at number 12 the way you look at something you expected to be worse. Helen looked up at him from the step. She did not stand up. He came up the front path. His eyes moved across the yard, the fence she had painted last week, still bright against the weathered post. The second-hand chairs on the porch, plastic, mismatched. Carol's window box next door, the last of the autumn flowers going. The general evidence of a life being assembled from available materials. New fence, plastic chairs, small yard. He stopped a few feet from the step. Helen. Richard. He looked at the paintbrush, at her clothes which had paint on them, at the house behind her. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said. "I'm doing fine. Thank you for coming." He put his hands in his pockets. "You don't have to live like this, you know. I want you to understand that. Whatever happened between us, I'm not trying to leave you with nothing." She heard what he said. She heard underneath it what he meant. That the paint on her hands, the plastic chairs, the small house on the ordinary street, was a condition to be corrected. That her being here was a problem he was offering to solve. That the fact of her apparent okayness was somehow an error in the data, and he had come to check the figures. "Would you like a glass of water?" she said. "I was going to take a break." "I'm fine." He stayed standing. She dipped the brush and kept going. He talked for a while. He mentioned the settlement carefully, the way you mention something you know is a live wire. He said Nathan was worried. He said she should think about what came next, practically speaking, because the money wouldn't last forever, and she wasn't getting any younger, and there were other options. Better options if she was willing to be reasonable about it. She listened. She ran the brush along the bottom rail, getting into the corner where the wood met the post. At some point, he stopped mid-sentence. She felt it before she looked up, the particular quality of a silence that means someone has just noticed something they didn't expect to notice. She glanced up. He was looking at her hands on the paintbrush, then at her sitting on the step, not having moved. One beat. He continued. Something about the winter, about heating costs in a house this old. She did not explain herself. There was nothing to explain. For 31 years, she had stopped whatever she was doing when he walked into a room, set down the book, turned off the program, put aside whatever had been occupying her hands. She had done it so automatically, she had stopped noticing it was a choice. Today, she kept painting. It was such a small thing. It was enormous. He left 20 minutes later. Said he hoped she'd think about what he'd said. She told him she would. He walked back down the path to his car, and she watched him the way you watch weather, noting it, not alarmed by it. The car door closed. The engine started. That sound she knew so well, moving away now, getting smaller, turning at the corner and going. She watched his car turn the corner and disappear, and then she dipped the brush back into the paint because the second coat wasn't going to finish itself. Nathan had chosen this restaurant, which meant he had thought about this, which meant he had been on the phone with his father more than he'd said. It was a Wednesday, 12 o'clock. A place near the center of town that was quiet at lunch, the kind of restaurant people chose when they wanted a conversation to happen in a controlled environment. Not too loud, not too intimate, easy to leave. Helen had dressed carefully that morning. Not for Richard, for herself. There was a difference, and she was only recently learning to feel it. She arrived first. Richard came in 5 minutes later. He looked around the room before he sat down. The old habit, checking who was there, who might see him. He nodded at Helen. She nodded back. They waited. Nathan came in from the cold, with his coat still buttoned the way he did when he was tense, and hadn't noticed yet that he was tense. He was 40 years old and looked in that moment very much like the boy who used to stand in doorways, deciding whether to come in. He sat down between them, not beside his mother, not beside his father. Between them, equidistant, the geometry of a man trying not to choose. Richard ordered water. Nathan ordered coffee. Helen ordered nothing, and the waitress, who understood something about the table without being told, moved quietly away. Richard spoke first. He was good at this, the measured opening, the reasonable tone, the way he framed things so that disagreement looked like irrationality. Helen had sat across from that voice for 31 years. She knew its architecture. He said Helen needed proper support. He said the house on Elm Street was a short-term situation that couldn't hold. He said he was concerned Nathan was concerned, and that there were options available if she was willing to consider them practically. He said all of this in the tone of a man presenting facts rather than preferences. Nathan's coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He did not look at Helen. Richard kept talking. Something about heating costs. Something about the winter. Helen watched her son's hands around the cup. She had known those hands since they were small enough to fit in her palm. She had measured their growth on a door frame in pencil. She knew the way they moved when he was listening carefully, and the way they stilled when he had already decided something but wasn't ready to say it. They were very still now. Richard finished. There was a pause, the kind that means the other person is supposed to respond in agreement, or at least in compromise. Nathan looked at his father, then down at the table. He did not look at Helen. Her own son, 40 years old. And he was sitting 6 inches away, and the distance felt like something you could not drive across. She waited one more moment. Then she placed her hand flat on the table, not reaching for anyone, not gripping anything, just placing it there steady. Nathan. He looked up, finally. You don't have to agree with me, she said, but I need you to know that I don't need to be rescued. I just need to be believed. He opened his mouth. She stood up, not angry, not dramatic, just done with the part of the conversation that was going to matter, because she could see from his face that the part that came next would not. Thank you for setting this up, she said to Nathan. She meant it. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked out through the lunch crowd, and the cold air coming in from the door, and the street that led back to Elm Street, and the house that was waiting for her. She got to her car. She sat down behind the wheel. She did not start the engine. The windshield showed her the ordinary street outside, a woman pushing a stroller, two men talking outside a sandwich shop, a pigeon working its way along the gutter with the focused purpose of something that had nowhere better to be, the world going about its Wednesday. She sat with her hands in her lap for a long time. She had been prepared to lose her husband. She had not been prepared for her son to look at her the way strangers do. She drove home. Carol's porch light was on across the street, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. Helen sat on her own front step in the coat she hadn't taken off yet. After a while, she heard Carol's door open, footsteps on the path. Carol came and sat down beside her on the step without asking anything, and without offering anything except the fact of being there. They sat until the street went quiet, and the cold came in properly, and neither of them moved. Carol didn't ask what happened. She just sat down on the step beside her, and they stayed there until the neighborhood was quiet, and the cold came in and neither of them moved.